All right, so this is what we were talking about last time. It's called taking the roof off, and if you guys will remember, we'll run through this pretty quick. First, I always put this up because this is how we can enter into conversations. This is the Columbo method that Kokol talks about in his tactics book, and it's gathering information, being clear who has to give reasons, and leading the conversation with questions. Now, the video examples that I have today, sometimes they're good about using questions to lead the conversation, and then other times it's more of statements. That's given the context of like open air apologetics and evangelism type stuff. So we'll see kind of a little bit of difference between the two, hopefully. But the first question, oh man, it's gonna really, yeah. I'll just hit back. Yeah, back arrow. Yep. So what do you mean by that? And that's where you're trying to gather more information about maybe a term or a phrase or something that they're talking about. So if the discussion is about, if the discussion is about some kind of moral topic and they say something is wrong, and you go, well, what do you mean by wrong? Do you mean like absolutely wrong or just that's your opinion wrong? Like what kind of wrong are you talking about? There's one example that the entire debate is lost because this guy didn't define his term. It's hilarious. Step 2, be clear on who has to give reasons. So when you understand what somebody is talking about and you've gathered enough information, just by understanding what they mean by what they're saying, then you can ask them how they reach that conclusion. And again, they have to give answers, which is the great thing about questions. If you ask a question, then the other person will hopefully respond by giving an answer. Sometimes they'll have an answer, sometimes they won't. It'll be kind of up in the air on how much they know about what they believe. And then once you've kind of understood what their conclusion is and how they got there, if there's any reasons that don't lead to that conclusion, or it's like, that doesn't seem like a very good reason, then you can point that out. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now. It's different things to notice in a conversation to point out kind of flaws in thinking. And so you can say, well, have you considered this or that? All right, last time we talked about taking the roof off, it's Francis Schaeffer. He came up with this. All human beings, this is a fact about the world, all human beings are made in the image of God and live in God's world that he created. And so anybody who has beliefs that deny these two facts, they live in contradiction to reality, just how things are. And that causes a point of tension that we can point at. So these contradictions become points of tension. A person constructs a roof of self-deception to protect themselves from that tension. But our job is to remove the roof and then let the cool breeze of reality blow on them, and then they get cold and have to construct a different roof. Hopefully that corresponds with reality. So real quick, some points of view logically lead to unacceptable conclusions. In the debate world, in logic texts, you'll see it called the reductio ad absurdum. So you're reducing it down to something that's absurd. So if they have a principle or a belief or a premise or something like that, if you take it seriously all the way to its natural conclusion, if it leads to an absurdity, then there's probably something wrong with the premise itself, and you should rethink it. That's the reductio ad absurdum. It exposes consequences of beliefs, so we'll see at least 3 examples of that, where it leads to a consequence, and this is like atheism, secularism, or relative morality. Those are all kind of grouped together, but there's different nuances, whether you're talking about someone who really believes that science is the only way to gain any kind of knowledge, well, that reduces to something absurd. Well, actually, it's just a category error, and we'll see actually an atheist point that out, which is interesting. But if you really believe that there is no God, then there are certain consequences to that belief. But most people don't take it to its logical conclusion. And so doing that is helpful. Some arguments prove too much. And the first example that we're going to go over, I think, will show that. And then some beliefs pay a high price. Like if you have to pay a high price just to hold on to that view. And if you have to throw out morality to hold on to a non-theistic worldview, that's too high of a price, I think. But not everybody thinks that way, which I think is dumb. So we reduce the view to a basic principle, premise, or assertion, and give the idea a test drive. So we go, okay, let's assume that this is true. If I follow this principle consistently, what would be the results? Does it lead to any absurd consequences? And are there any unintended consequences that seem counterintuitive when you hold on to this belief or this premise? Then you exploit that point of tension, gently but directly, and you point it out and go, do you see this? And of course, Kokel's going to advocate, use questions so that way they can think through it themselves. I'm sorry, this is super quick. I can see you're trying to take notes, and I'm sorry. There's a video on YouTube that I could share with you that we go through this much slower, at a much slower pace if you want to check it out. But the goal is to cause a little bit of pain and show the illogic of the view, and then invite the person to think about it, if it were really true. So we went through these examples. Jesus and the Pharisees, when they claimed that he was casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. A house divided cannot stand. If you take that reasoning to its logical conclusion, then the devil is against himself, and he's going to destroy his own kingdom. Like, that can't be true. It can't be true that Jesus is doing this by the power of Beelzebub. The born this way example, minimalist ethics. So as long as I'm not hurting anybody, it's fine. It's like, well, there's lots of, we went over different examples of how that proves too much or it allows too many things. Moral relativism, atheistic evolution, and the modified pro-choice abortion stance. Those are the examples from last week. I have a new one, and it's consent as the sexual ethic. So if you talk to anybody about sexual ethics today, usually their ethic is going to be around consent. So the basic premise is everything is permissible as long as everyone gives their consent. Now notice, this assumes a lot about what a human being is. A human being is a kind of being that can give consent. So we're already assuming that human beings have rights, and they can decide as individuals whether or not they can consent to certain things. And there's like this underlying bubbling idea of rights and consent of the individual, because the individual is, from a Christian worldview, the individual is made in the image of God, and that's why we're valuable and why we have rights. God gives us rights. The government doesn't give us rights. So that's unsaid, but that's kind of boiling underneath. But notice, everything is permissible as long as everyone gives their consent. Now, if that's the basic premise, then what are some ways where everybody can give consent, but it leads to an absurdity? Or at least it's something you're like, oh, that doesn't seem like it should be morally permissible, even though everybody's giving consent. Open marriages? Yeah. Right, yeah. Have an open marriage. Yeah, polyamory, right? So at that point, I would ask, what do you mean by consent? Because if we're talking about a marriage, like that's you signed something.
That's why I said it's an oxymoron.
Right.
People hold that in their head
Right.
and think it's okay.
Mm-hmm. So, but now we're talking about almost like different layers of consent, right? I've made a promise and a commitment before a group of people, and I've signed a document that says that the government can recognize that this relationship is this kind of relationship, and I've signed my name on. Like, that's a high level of consent, right? Whereas usually what people want is they just want to have sex with whoever they want, whenever they want, as long as everybody says yes, then it's fine. That's a different kind of consent, right? Or at least relative to the written. Although people go, marriage licenses are just a piece of paper, so it doesn't really matter anymore, right? But what kind of consent are we talking about? So that would be a good question to ask, or a good opportunity to ask the first question. What do you mean by consent?
Well, there's no problem with that, because there's a very fine line between consent and coercion.
Ah,
And there's lots of times where people consent, but they really don't intend to consent. And that's one of the arguments that comes in the rape question.
Yep.
Is, did she consent or did she get coerced into it?
what were
Or
the
is it
what?
just regret? Like there's rape.
Yeah, what were the circumstances surrounding the situation?
And then there's no line.
Right.
Right, because what you define as consent, I might see as coercion, she might see
Right.
as complete manipulation. So now there's no line. It's blurred.
Yeah. So just for the recording, it's another question of like, what do you mean by consent? People can have different views of what consent means. Is it consent or was it coercion? You know, in cases of rape, there's like that's one of the biggest questions that needs to be answered before you can, you know, come to a determination. So that's, yeah. I remember there was a silly video. Oh, nice. There was a silly video like where, because on college campuses, everybody's just sleeping with everybody and all that. And so consent was like this, like they have like seminars on what consent is. So that way they're trying to battle date rape culture on college campuses. And so they made this video, or not the college, but some other, you know, they were making fun of it. And it was essentially like this boy and girl were, you know, they're about to have sex, and they stop and they're like, oh wait, do you consent? Do you consent? It's like, yeah, I do. And then they both pull out contracts, and they like check all the boxes of what's okay and what's not okay before they start. So that way there's no ambiguity, and everybody's on the same page. And then they negotiate, you know, because maybe he wants something that she doesn't really like, but they negotiate. And then they both sign, and then it's like, cool, it's good to go. Like, that's the level of consent that's needed before you won't be accused of date rape. And that seems absurd, right? Why? Or why not, right? That video was made as a joke, but the reason it's funny is because there's some truth to it, right? I was like, this is almost what is needed in order to have that. So here are some examples that I came up with. What about the emancipated 17-year-old? So that means they're no longer under their parental authority. So in our nation, 18 years old is the age of consent, or age of like adulthood, right? But due to circumstances or maybe just life circumstances, maybe a 17-year-old gains their emancipation and they don't have to have parental permission to do things anymore. This would seem like, as this is the basic premise, that it seems like that's okay. It proves too much. Hyper-degrading pornography. It's like everybody signs a contract and everybody consents to everything that happens, right? So it's okay. It's like, but that doesn't make any sense. I mean, just pornography in general is very degrading, but there's obviously degrees of that. But the whole point is, everything is permissible as long as there's consent. And if that's the basic premise, it would seem to allow this, and that seems absurd. So I'm trying to push the point that it's absurd. So, and then the last one, I think this is the one that is the reductio ad absurdum. Incest. You would have to go outside this basic premise to say that that's not permissible. I mean, think about it. As long as everybody's adults, as long as everybody consents, it's fine. And if you go, ew, then that's just your taboo in your mind. And you need to get over that. You're so close-minded. Love is love. Love is love. You can't stop who you love. Right? Yeah, and you go, ew, gross. Right? Yeah, exactly. That's the point, right? It's like, and so if I were to bring up that example as like, no, this proves too much. And then they would go, well, the reason we don't allow incest is because of the problems it would cause for their offspring. Right? That would be well, that's why we don't allow it. Or there might be some kind of, they might make an argument against some kind of power dynamic if it's like parent-child. I know. That's how absurd, right? It's absurd. Okay, that's the point. The truth is, they're trying to make a separation of sex and commitment, and you can't. That's not how the world is built. Consent is not the same as commitment. And with sex comes commitment. That's what's supposed to be. That's why there's the institution of marriage. But the more you try and pry those two things apart, the more wickedness and crazy, absurd things you have to allow in order to do what you want to do. All right, so now we got some videos. So this is Christopher Hitchens and Doug Wilson. This is a pretty old video, but what it points out is from the secular worldview, they don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to calling things wrong. And what you'll notice is, Doug Wilson is the bearded guy. He'll just say, by what standard? And Christopher Hitchens will go, that's a really good question. It's like, because he's got nothing. But it's pretty interesting. So,
and one of Christianity's specifically horrible contributions to human mythology and delusion is the idea, the terrifying idea, that you could be tortured forever.
Horrible by what standard?
Horrible by, well, good question.
Yeah, I know.
Good.
I don't know, whoever made this video just inserted the memes, but...
No, but horrible, well, shall I say, let me ask anyone here who doesn't think it's a horrible idea to put up their hand.
So he's appealing to the
So it
crowd.
doesn't seem to require much explanation, does it, as a horrible idea?
Well,
What, do you feel you need a standard to keep your hand down at the moment? Or did I just say something that was, so to speak, morally self-evident?
there's a difference between an emotional reaction to something. Every person.
Oh, I think they're using their heads.
No,
Douglas.
there's a difference between an emotional reaction, which all of us have. Everybody with natural affection thinks it's a terrible idea to think of people perishing eternally. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do you give an accounting of what is good and what is bad? When you say, if the universe is, on your accounting, time and chance acting on matter, if all the universe is matter in motion, what do you mean, horrible? What do you mean by horrible idea? Who cares?
Why do we care? Very good point. Very good question. I ask myself a lot why that is. I think it's because I am one of the higher primates.
I'm Michael Jordan. Stop it. Get some help.
That's not a rallying cry.
It appears to be, no, it's not much of a rallying cry, but it has the merit of being true. It appears to be the part of the equipment, intellectual and moral equivalent of our primate species, that it does have a need to help its fellow creatures, as well as to torture, kill, rape, enslave, and exploit them. It does have a feeling quite a strong one, that there's a human need to help, and that you might need help yourself someday. So,
so
be
how do
nice
you-
to your neighbor. So why not? Now,
How do you sort it out?
not everyone has this. I mean, there are quite a lot of people also presumably made in the image of God, I think a superfluous assumption to be making, but also made in the image of God, according to you, who are born sociopathic. They don't care about other people. They just can't be made to. They just won't and don't. They're a problem for the rest of us. And then there are people who are born psychopathic, who positively need to see others suffer
If our
and have a
species-
bad time.
If our species has within it the seeds of a gregarious lend a helping hand, and we have a herd instinct and we want to help out, we have that instinct, and we also have the instinct to go to war and fight and do all these terrible things that we do. I've got instinct A and instinct B. What is it that tells you which one is right?
Same as you, I would say.
God?
No.
The
No, you knew all that before you'd ever read the Bible.
Here's the issue. Of course, I can feel a certain way before I can give an accounting of it. But what I'm asking for is, given your premises, given your assumptions, given what you say the universe is, given all that, how do you give an accounting of which way you go?
All right, so the point there.
One of Christian.
The point there is, right at the end, he points it out. He goes, if you have instinct A and instinct B, if it's just based on our instincts, our natural instincts, he goes, well, some of our species have this instinct to do good by each other and try, live harmoniously with each other, try to build up our tribe. That's instinct A. The other instinct is to kill anyone that tries to threaten our tribe, and war and genocide and all the most horrible things that are part of human nature. Those are both instincts within the human primate, higher evolved primate species. Which one is right? Notice you can't appeal to either one to justify itself. You have to have some other higher standard to help you determine between the two. That was Wilson's point. And there's nothing on the atheistic worldview that can give you that. It's just whichever one feels stronger at the moment. So if right now it feels good to help somebody, I guess that's the right thing to do. It just feels right. But if right now I disagree with you politically and it would be convenient for me to murder you so you don't promote your political views, then if that's stronger, then that's the one that wins out. And it ends up being whichever, might makes right. There's no other way around it. And by might, I guess I'm equivocating on might. Might usually means like, if you're powerful enough to do whatever you want, then do it. I'm changing that to be whichever one of these instincts is stronger wins out. And it's the strength of that feeling that justifies the action. And that's super scary because you have strong feelings about lots of things that are immoral. But you need some kind of standard to talk about that. So this guy asks the same question. It's more about relativism, but this guy does a really good job of asking questions. And it's only like a minute long, but he does just notice the difference. I guess Wilson was asking questions like, by what standard? What do you mean by that? How can you justify that? You can't give an accounting of that. How do you give an accounting? He just goes, oh, we're a higher primate. That's the best he can do. This guy has like very specific and pointed questions that are really good. It's interesting.
Okay, so the pedophile's personal thought process is it's okay to molest children. Is he wrong?
There's a difference from acting upon what you think, and
Let's say he acts on it.
if he acts on it, he's wrong.
So, do we make that distinction in our own moral thinking? That there's a difference between action and just thought?
Well, we do, yes.
Okay.
Jesus does not, or God does not.
There's a little bit of nuance there that I think could use some exploring. But so when it comes to our relationship with God, sin separates us from God. Doesn't matter what the sin is. No, it could be lust in my heart, or it could be physical adultery. But the consequences of those two things are different. But whether or not they separate us from God, that's always going to be the same. Does that make sense? So there is a little bit of what he's saying where it's like, it's kind of true, but only kind of, right? You got to kind of parse it out. So now he says we're gonna get rid of that idea of where he's just thinking about it. Now we have a pedophile who acts on it. Now what do you say about that? If he acts on it, he's wrong. That's what he's saying.
By what standard?
By the standard is he just acted on an underage person.
Yeah, by what standard is that wrong? Whose standard?
The governments we have in place.
Okay, and in the 1800s, the government said it was okay to enslave black people. Were they wrong?
So did you notice that? He said the standard is the government said so. That's the standard. So then he goes, okay, cool. I'll take that for a test drive. Let's see if this applies in another area and does it lead to an absurd conclusion. And of course it does, right? But he's taking the roof off and he's going, okay, cool. If that's what morality is, it's just we have laws against it and the government enforces those laws, then it wasn't illegal to have slaves.
Oh, yeah, it wasn't illegal, but it was immoral.
Right. Well, he's about to get to that, but he's saying the standard is established by government, and what he's ultimately trying to get to is no. There needs to be an even higher standard than just the government. But I keep pausing it. So here you go.
They would not have been punished about it because the government did not punish that.
Should the government have punished them?
Should the government have? Sure, yeah, they should have.
By what standard?
By the standard as they shouldn't have enslaved black people. Slavery
Says
is
who?
awful.
The slaveholders didn't say that. People at that time didn't say it. Says who?
Says people during that time, some people, the reason
Christians, who had a view of absolute morality. You see, you can't account for right and wrong without absolute morality. All you have is individual preferences. Do you see that?
So it's right there, right? He just led him straight to that conclusion through his questions and pointing out, like, it was beautiful, right? He just went right to the logical conclusion.
Okay, so the pedophile's personal.
All right, this is another one that's kind of funny. So it's there's some Jehovah's Witnesses that show up at John Neufeld's. I don't know who John Neufeld is, but Jehovah's Witnesses show up at his door and they have a conversation. And the way he deals with it is really, really funny. But he takes the roof off by pointing out that you can't consistently do the principle that the Jehovah's Witnesses are trying to promote. And if we're not careful, we'll start doing the same thing.
I had a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses that came to my door, told them I was a Christian, and they said, they said, are you going door to door? And I said, no, I never go door to door because people hate you when you go to their door. So I don't. So they said, well, did you know that the Bible tells you that you've got to go door to door? They said, look, in Acts chapter 4, the apostles went from house to house. I know the context of that. They went from house to house to the people within their church. And I know that, but I wasn't going to argue that. I simply said to them, well, as a matter of fact, the Bible also tells us that the apostles went to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. Have you guys gone there? And, well, I don't understand. I said, well, if the Bible commands us, you see, this is the point I'm trying to make. Yeah. What Luke is giving us is a historical, detailed account of how the church actually began to grow. Of course, there are points of application that we need to make, but we don't take simply a statement of fact and make it into a command.
So notice, he took their principle. They're like, you're not reading the Bible correctly. This is a command, right? Or you're misinterpreting it. It says, go house to house. You have to do this. And he goes, okay, well, if we take your very literal Bible reading and apply it to other places, it leads to an absurdity. It's like, why didn't you go to Derbe or Lystra or Iconium? It's like, well, of course not. But then you're applying a different hermeneutic, a different way of interpretation for some parts of the Bible and not other parts of the Bible. So when it's convenient for you to argue with this man at his door about how he should be going door to door, you'll interpret it one way. But when it's not convenient and he points it out, then you'll interpret it another way. That's inconsistent. And it leads, like, Derbe and Lystra and Iconium don't exist anymore. He couldn't go there. But that's why it was funny. That's why everybody laughed, because you can clearly see how absurd that is. And so we have to be a bit more careful in our Bible reading and interpretation, and how we get to application. So first you read the text and you observe what's there. From the observation, it's within its historical and grammatical context. The Gospels were written to first century people, right? Or a letter of Paul was written to the church at Corinth at that time. It's to those people, right? It wasn't to you in that way. It is for you, but it's not to you. So you have to understand what Paul was getting at when he was writing to the Colossian church or the church at Corinth. That's your interpretation of what Paul was getting at that time in that place. That's your interpretation. Now, from that interpretation, we can make application to our modern world and our time and our place. Some things will fit, some things won't. But if you take a very, very literal reading like the Jehovah's Witness person was trying to do and make direct application the way that they did, it will lead to absurdities. And that's what that guy pointed out. And so he's taking the roof off and going, you're being inconsistent with how you're reading the Bible.
I had a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses.
All right. Let's see, this one. Let me skip to the next one. It's 1042. Cool. Yeah, this one. I think this is the one that I was...
So I would encourage you to press your atheist friends to be intellectually consistent and not to be intellectual hypocrites. To be intellectually consistent means, if I believe in Jesus Christ, I better not go out and womanize after I finish talking out here about Christ, right? And if you're an atheist, to be intellectually consistent means you better face the despair of life, the meaninglessness of life, the relativity of morality, which means, you know something? It doesn't matter whether I steal his wallet or whether I give him money for lunch. It's all just a choice. And if I choose to feed him lunch, great. And if I choose to steal his wallet, just as great, because it's my choice. And don't you dare tell me that one is better than the other, because that's a qualitative distinction you're making, and it's based on a whole view of goodness and justice. And if you're an atheist, you have to acknowledge those don't exist, because there's no mind prior to the human mind who defines what is good versus what is evil, what is just versus what is unjust.
He's pretty great.
Yeah. Cliff Nechtel. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but yeah, he has a ton of stuff on social media, and he just goes out to either college campuses or public areas and talks about. He just tries to share the gospel, tries to share his faith with people, gets it on video, posts it on the internet, but he gets into a lot of these similar arguments about either morality or the reliability of the Bible, or just a bunch of apologetics type questions. And this is one that that is good to know. It's like, if you really believe that there is no God, then he's right. You have to face the despair of life. Everything's going to end in heat death. 2,000 years from now, no one's going to remember you, and no one's going to remember how you wronged that person that you wronged yesterday. 2,000 years from now. 5 years after you're dead, nobody's going to remember that. Nobody's going to care. It's all leads to nothing. Everything on the grandest scale. So why be moral? Why? Yeah, why? It doesn't matter. If that's your view. Now you have to know that your life is completely meaningless. And most people that I've talked to, they go, yeah, I get that. And it's actually the video before that. She's like, yes, life is chaos, and I embrace the chaos, and isn't my life wonderful? And he goes, you can't just go, oh, ultimately my life is pond scum, and isn't this pond scum wonderful? That doesn't make any sense. Like, you have to deal, and if you read existentialist philosophers like Camus and Sartre, and there's one other one, but I can't remember, they deal with that. Camus says the only question that's really relevant to all philosophy is, why should I not commit suicide? Because ultimately nothing matters if atheism is true. So I hope these they're like little 1 minute videos. You can see someone makes a claim and the other person pulls the roof off and tries to point out, hey, that leads to an absurd conclusion. Do you realize that? And the other person will probably push back against it, but it's like, no, you need to see that this is ridiculous, and you need to know that. And that's what Kokol is talking about in this chapter by taking the roof off. It leads to an absurd conclusion. Yes?
That just reminds me of the verse that says, if there's not Christ, we're of all men most miserable.
Yep.
And that's the atheist.
Yep.
If they truly understand the end is, you have nothing to live for. I mean, nothing is good. Nothing is right.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's time to go. Come on. There we go. All right. Here we go. Now, if Christ is preached that he rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. If Christ be not risen, then is our preaching in vain, so it's empty. There's nothing, there's no content, and your faith is also in vain. And we are found false witnesses of God because we've testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he has not raised up. If so be that the dead rise not. And if the dead rise not, then is not Christ raised. So Christ isn't raised. And if Christ is not raised, your faith is vain, and you are yet in your sins. Then they also which are fallen asleep, they're dead and gone forever. There's no hope for them. And if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we're of all men most miserable. Why? Because we suffer for Christ's sake. Why suffer anything? What's the point? Why not get as much pleasure as you can? You're just going to die anyways. No one's going to remember your name. There are millions and millions and millions of people from the ancient world. We have no idea who they were. You don't know them. I don't know them. They're just a blip in history. Nobody cares, except a personal God in heaven who does care about every individual. All right. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your love. Thank you that you do care about us and that you came to save us. Thank you for leaving your throne in heaven, coming down and being a man, taking on the form of a slave and dying a rebellious slave's death, just so our sin could be paid for. Lord, we praise you and we glorify you for that sacrifice, but also for the resurrection, because it's that resurrection that proves you are the king of this world, of the whole universe, and that it's your creation, that you get to set the rules, and that it's our purpose and meaning in life to know you and to follow after you and to obey those rules. Lord, I pray that we can see a little bit more clearly how questions can lead to these conclusions, and we can be more effective ambassadors for you. And Lord, help us to worship you now as we head upstairs in Jesus' name. Amen.